All right, let's talk about the rat race. We'll mostly talk about Jauch here, but we can start a little bit with Cooper's The Leisure Agenda, which gives us some facts which dramatize or highlight how much people work in the U.S. at least. So, U.S. workers work longer hours than peer nations, than nations with comparable GDP or GDP per capita. This wasn't always the case. In the 70s, we were pretty average. The U.S. was, U.S. workers worked about as much as workers in comparable countries. The U.S. also scores pretty low, pretty close to like the median in GDP per hour worked. So that is, each hour that you work in the U.S. on average contributes less to the country's economic output than in most other countries with comparable economies, developed economies. We could get more bang for our buck out of we could be more productive in that sense. There are a few things that make it especially hard to take time off work. We have no sort of state-protected parental leave, like they do in many other countries. And we have relatively stingy unemployment benefits, compared to countries like Australia or especially the Netherlands. 2/3 of households in the U.S. have less than 1 year of income in retirement savings. So, we just don't save up enough to retire when we reach retirement age. Oh, I should say 2/3 of U.S. households aged 50 to 64. So people nearing retirement age. I'm not especially close to retirement age. I have $0 in retirement savings, but if I'm like most people in the U.S., I will still not have that much even when I approach retirement age. Nearly 20% of people in the U.S. over the age of 65 are still working. Okay, those are some of the some facts which can dramatize or sort of highlight just how much people work, at least in the U.S. Jauch frames this as the problem of overemployment. There's underemployment, which is a problem. People who want to work, especially because they want an income, but they can't find work, or they can't find enough of it. But there's also a problem of overemployment. People who would be willing to work, who would prefer to work less, and including people who would prefer to work less, even if it came with a pay cut. This is, as Jauch primarily notes, a problem for the overemployed workers themselves. It's also a problem for the underemployed. So, there are all of these, as somebody observed once, among millennials, there's, it seems like half of the people are working way too hard, and half the people are barely employed or unemployed. So, there's this sort of weird lopsided distribution of all of the work there is to be done, at least in my generation. At least that's how it seems. So the idea anyway is that there are all of these people who want to work more, and all these people who are working too much, and somehow we're not able to find the right kind of balance here. Okay. So there's this problem of overemployment. Jauch frames it primarily as a problem for the overemployed themselves, although I was just trying to say why it might also be a problem for the underemployed. Now, very generally, there are two things that you could do with this problem, especially from the point of view of the state, although Jauch notes some other solutions might come from unionization, for example, not from the state, but from workers themselves, organizing. There are two things you could do. One, he says, is the laissez-faire approach. Laissez-faire meaning hands off. You don't do anything. The obvious problem, so you don't try to impose any kind of regulation or restrictions on working time. You don't try to intervene in the hours that people work. And the obvious problem with that is that it doesn't solve the problem. There's still the problem of overemployment, and to the extent that it feeds into the problem of underemployment, there's that problem too. Okay. The other approach is to intervene. So the state could step in, or unions could step in, or industry groups representing owners or management throughout an industry could step in to solve the problem. Okay. Some outside force could step in and try to institute some policy which would reduce working time. Now, then there are two sorts of problems here. One is a sort of very practical question, which is just which working time, there are lots of ways of doing this, and which one is best, which one would work most effectively to, lower working time without imposing especially horrible costs. So, is it going to be through unions? Is it going to be through industry groups? Is it going to be through state or city or federal government? What's it going to be? Is it going to be a fine for, charging workers too much? Is it going to be, this could take all sorts of forms. So there's this practical question. It's like, what would this policy look like? What sorts of policy would most effectively reduce people's working time? That's one sort of question. Jauch does not, notes there are a number of possible answers to this, but doesn't try to settle that question, at least not in this piece. The other question, which he notes, is a maybe more fundamental, or at least more straightforwardly philosophical question, which is just effectively, what business is it of the state to or of industry groups, for that matter, or perhaps even of unions, to try to impose regulations on people's working time? Doesn't this, as he says, doesn't this inappropriately impose a particular conception of the good life on people? So it's like, if the state comes in and says, okay, we're going to use some regulation to try to, get all these overemployed people to work less, doesn't that mean that the state is coming in and sort of saying, well, here's our opinion about what makes for a good life, what makes for a happy life, what makes for an appropriate work-life balance? And you say, well, there's this concern. Isn't that sort of overstepping the boundaries that the state should operate within? Doesn't it involve the state sort of taking a stance inappropriately on this contentious philosophical question of what the right work-life balance is, or what the right way to live is, what sort of role of work should play in people's larger lives? Okay, so there's this question which is like, well, if we were to intervene, especially if the state were to intervene in working time, wouldn't that mean inappropriately imposing a particular conception of the good life, a particular way of thinking about what makes for a successful work-life balance on people who might, after all, disagree with the state? Okay. Jauch says there's not a... Jauch is an interventionist. He thinks that actually the state, or perhaps some other actor, perhaps unions, perhaps industry groups, something else, should intervene to regulate working time, to prevent people from being overemployed, and that you don't have to be the state doesn't have to take a particular stance on the good life, or it doesn't have to take a particular stance on what the appropriate work-life balance is in order for it to do that. So Jauch is an interventionist. He thinks that outside actors should step in to reduce working time among the overemployed in at least some cases, and that it's not inappropriate for the state, at least, to take on this kind of role of regulating working time. Okay, and I'm back. And the reason ultimately that Jauch says we should intervene is that working time, competition over working time, amounts to a type of prisoner's dilemma that he calls the rat race. So here's how the rat race works. workers need to demonstrate a willingness to work longer hours than their competitors, either so that they get certain perks of work, they get promotions, they get benefits, they get the hours they want, or to prevent some type of harm at work, so that they're not fired, they're not demoted, they don't have their hours docked. Okay. So this leads to a situation where everybody, or maybe everybody more or less, would prefer to work shorter hours. But given that their coworkers are working these long hours, it's individually rational for them to work long hours too. So we end up with a collective action problem, a situation where what's individually rational for each worker who's only looking after themselves by assumption leads to a situation that's worse for most people involved. Jauch describes, maybe this sounds familiar because we were talking about prisoner's dilemmas a few weeks ago in class, and Jauch describes the rat race as a prisoner's dilemma. So remember that a prisoner's dilemma is... Do you need something? Okay. Remember that a prisoner's dilemma is a situation where, in some sense, the best outcome for every player is if they all cooperate. But no matter what the other players are doing, each player will be better off if she or he cheats. So in the rat race, working shorter hours is cooperating, and working longer hours is cheating. Don't get too hung up on the word cheating. Cheating doesn't mean that it's necessarily bad. Here's a little footnote. This is not Jauch speaking. This is me. I'm not sure that that the rat race actually is a prisoner's dilemma. So remember, a prisoner's dilemma is a situation with two features at least. There's a dominant strategy, which means that there's a choice that each player can make that they're going to be better off making no matter what anybody else is doing. So it's dominant, meaning that no matter what anyone else is doing, you're better off cheating. There's also only one equilibrium in the prisoner's dilemma. An equilibrium is a situation where none of the players can do anything differently that would improve their own outcome. So each individual player can't do anything else without making things worse off for themselves. So it's an equilibrium in that sense. It's not clear that the rat race is like this. It's not clear that the rat race is a game where there's a dominant strategy and only one equilibrium. Here's why I think that. It might be the case that you're better off working longer hours if your coworkers are working longer hours because you don't want to be fired. But if your coworkers are working shorter hours, you might be better off working shorter hours too. If that's the case, then there's no dominant strategy because what's best for you to do depends on what other people are doing. It might also be that this is a situation where there's not just one equilibrium, but there are two equilibria. There's the situation where you both work shorter hours, and no matter you're not going to be better off by working longer hours. Nobody's going to be better off by working longer hours. So nobody else can improve their own situation by doing anything differently. So that's sometimes called the cooperative equilibrium. Everybody works shorter hours. There's also another equilibrium where everyone works long hours and nobody else can, if you open yourself up to being fired or demoted or whatever, if you work shorter hours, so you don't want to do that. So if this is how the rat race works, if it's a two equilibrium situation with no dominant strategy, then this is the type of game that is sometimes called a stag hunt. So I should say that if this is right, then Jauch is wrong. The rat race is not a prisoner's dilemma. But if it's not a prisoner's dilemma, that doesn't mean that his overall argument isn't still, basically sound. So it could, even if the rat race is a stag hunt and not a prisoner's dilemma, it could still make sense to for outside actors to come and intervene and try to nudge people towards the cooperative equilibrium, the everybody works shorter hours equilibrium, because everybody's going to be better off that way. So the fact that if it is a fact that the rat race is a stag hunt doesn't mean that we shouldn't regulate working hours. It doesn't mean that Jauch is in Jauch's main conclusion is wrong. But should keep an eye out when he says that something is a prisoner's dilemma. You want to ask yourself, is it really a prisoner's dilemma? Is there really a dominant strategy and a single equilibrium here, or is it more like a stag hunt? Is it there's no dominant strategy and there are multiple equilibria? Okay. I know that went into the weeds for a second. That got a little technical for a second. So, if your brain hurts, I'm sorry. But that was all just sort of a footnote. You don't really need to know this in order to understand Jauch. I think it's just it's an objection or a possibility that's worth considering. That said, back to Jauch. Now, what do you need to know to understand Jauch? Well, remember when we were talking about the prisoner's dilemma? One way that you can solve a prisoner's dilemma is by playing the game repeatedly, right? So, if you have to interact with people again and again and again and again, then you might that means that you're more likely to cooperate. There's something in it for you if you can both convince the other that you're willing to cooperate in the long run. And so that's one way you can solve prisoner's dilemmas, is by getting people to interact repeatedly, to play the game repeatedly. In the case of the rat race, that evidently doesn't work, right? So merely having people in the same workplace where they, stare each other down day after day doesn't automatically solve the problem of overemployment. It doesn't automatically solve the rat race. So you need some outside force to come in. That could be the employer, it could be a union, it could be the state, it could be an industry group to change the game. So somehow to encourage cooperation or communication between workers, to change the options that the workers have on the table by removing the option of working longer hours, or changing the payouts that are associated. So, to make working longer hours pay off less, or to reduce the risks associated with working shorter hours, for example. Okay. And, this is the argument for interventionism in a nutshell, is that you don't have to take a stand on what the appropriate work-life balance is. You just have to say, well, this is a collective action problem that people can't solve by themselves. And so some outside force needs to step in. And if the state is in a good position to do that, it can do that. So if you've got a collective action problem that people can't solve on their own, and the state can help solve, then this is something the state could come in and do. Or if not the state, employers, industry groups, unions, and so on. Okay. That's the heart of Jauch's argument, really. But just a few things to note before we wrap up. He notes there are a few things that feed into overemployment. So, for example, there might be high transaction costs associated with hiring people. You have to do a search, you have to train people up, and so on. And so, one of the causes of overemployment might just be that, the cost of training new employees is so high that you want to reduce the total number of employees that you have and just cram a bunch of working hours into those relatively small number of employees. I'll say that, I think that's true. I think this is one of the causes of overemployment. I think there's also, even just from a managerial point of view, there are some reasons not to do this. Namely that if you're really super duper dependent on one worker who's working 100 hours a week and then they quit, well, then you're screwed, right? Whereas if you have 5 workers working 20 hours a week and one of them quits, and they each need to add 5 hours of work a week to make up for it, that's not so hard. Okay, so there's a sort of robustness argument here that if you have more employees working fewer hours, there are higher training costs, but you also take on less risk in case the employee decides to leave. Something to consider just from a self-interested managerial point of view. Okay. Jauch draws this analogy between the rat race and standing on your tiptoes at a concert, or the education arms race, where parents try to get their kids into the best test prep classes and all that. I think I'll just note one little additional footnote. I think the education arms race and tiptoes at a concert, again, probably are stag hunts rather than prisoners' dilemmas. It's better for you to stand on your tiptoes if everybody else is standing on their tiptoes, but it's better for you not to stand on your tiptoes if nobody else is standing on their tiptoes. Ditto with goofy test prep classes, Princeton Review or whatever. One especially dangerous form that the rat race can take is what's called competitive presenteeism. We talked about this a bit during the pandemic, just as a society, but there's this thing that workers do, which is that they compete to show how loyal they are to a company by showing up to work when they're sick. But of course, if you're a contagious person and you show up to work when you're sick, employers sometimes reward this sort of thing. Oh wow, this person is so dedicated. They showed up to work even though they had the flu. It's like no. You're if you're sick and contagious, you're not helping anybody by showing up. You are increasing the likelihood that other people will get sick and either have to stay home or show up to work and at the very least be less productive. Okay. These, I mean, the objection that Jauch considers at the end of the reading is that, well, the state doesn't need to come in and solve every collective action problem, right? So he considers, well, maybe everybody would prefer to pay $10 less for a new TV. But they end up competing with one another for scarce TVs, and they end up paying $10 more. And it's like, well, the state could come in and solve this collective action problem by, helping people form consumer co-ops or something like that. But that's a huge pain in the ass. That's a lot for the state to do just for a very minimal benefit, and maybe no benefit at all ultimately if it reduces the production of high quality TVs, which is what people are after anyway. So it's not like the state needs to come in and solve every collective action problem that it encounters. But Jauch's response to this, very briefly, is just that, well, no, it doesn't need to solve every collective action problem, but overemployment is like a serious problem. It's not just that people want to save a buck when they're buying a new TV. It's that people are stuck at work, not being especially productive, and missing out on everything else that you can enjoy in, your one life on Earth, right? So it's not that the state needs to solve every collective action problem, but that because it is a collective action problem, the actors can't solve entirely on their own. The state or some other outside force is justified in stepping in because the problem is so serious, and at least if the solutions are right, they're not going to be as costly as the problem itself. Okay, that's it on the rat race. And I will see you next week in class. Good work.